Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we want to look at comparing two Synology NASs, both of which have been released just a few months apart and part of the same series. Today we are looking at the recently released Synology DS423 Plus, and we're comparing it against the even more recently released and revealed, or not in that order, DS224 Plus. And in this video, I'm going to help you decide which one best deserves your data. But more importantly, I think the real subtext of this video is going to be, is this NAS here worth about 150 Nika more? Because when you look at both these solutions, I don't normally compare a 2 and a 4 bay NAS, because generally when I compare NAS devices, I kind of go for a bit like for like, not the chalk and cheese thing I've gone for here. However, there are a lot of users trying to make their way into the Synology ecosystem for the first time. Maybe they're jumping away from other brands or third-party cloud services, or they're upgrading an existing Synology NAS, and they are looking at these two devices very similar in architecture but with very different pricing, and wondering which way their budget should go, because there is actually other differences, not just the fact that one is a 2 bay and one is a 4 bay. And in this video, I'm going to help you decide which one best deserves your data, and ultimately which one is going to be best for you and your budget. Now, throughout the course of this video, unfortunately, try as I might to control the sound level, I've got two NASs over there running two rather high RAID scrubbing operations over there that I can't cease for another video. So you may hear them, a low rumbling hum and just a general fan noise there just off camera. So I apologise if that's getting picked up in the mic. I'll try and remove as much as I can in post. But before we go any further, it's worth touching on, regardless of which one of these two you go for, what you are guaranteed to get. And so straight away, you are going to get full access to Synology's DSM platform. So all of the applications run on both of these devices to a near identical degree, with a few exceptions that we'll touch on later on. On top of that, both of these support a myriad of third-party applications. They both support a range of USB devices connected to it, not as many as some people would like. Again, more of that later on. Alongside that, you've got a lot of control with regards to wake on LAN. You've also got scheduled on off. You've also got a very efficient architecture, with both of these arriving with incredibly similar hardware inside that we'll talk about in the hardware section. On top of that, both of these devices support DLNA, UPnP. They arrive with a range of supported remote access protocols. So if you don't want to rely on just the network, you can use Synology's own Quick Connect system, or third-party ones like TeamViewer, Tailscale. There are a bunch out there, along with third-party applications and services you can install inside. On top of that, both of these arrive with a myriad of client applications for Windows, for Mac, for Android, for iOS, all of which can be tailored to the way you want to access the system, along with container management support, virtual machine application support, a huge degree of support in surveillance station, and an AI photo recognition and Plex media server support to largely the same degree for both 1080p and 4K native playback, as well as transcoding, thanks to integrated graphics on both of these systems. What I'm saying is that regardless of which one of these two you go for, you're going to get a great Synology experience, regardless of which one ends up in your home or business. But you did not come here to see what was the same. You came to this video because you wanted to know what was different, and ultimately what way your money should be going. So let's crack on straight away with price and value. So as I already touched on earlier in the video, there is a price distinction of about 150 Nika between these two devices. To go into a little bit more specifics, the DS224 Plus arrives at about 300 to 350 Nika mark, depending where you are in the world. Now, it's going to be based on your local currency, and of course your tax and your shipping included as well. Now, in the case of the DS423, it's been in the market just a little bit longer, just a handful of months, and in that time it's already seen a couple of promos on different popular websites and seasonal events, but ultimately you can pick this up for about 450 to 500 Nika. So again, between them is about 150, give or take, price difference between them. Now, how is that reflected in terms of value? Well, you've got to factor in, for starters, that these aren't just the hardware. If you were looking at just getting the hardware and you weren't including the cost of DSM, the services, the support, all of that stuff rolled in, for the hardware, that's actually quite expensive. You could build an Intel quad-core, couple of gig memory NAS system like these for 2 or 4 bays for much less than that, probably around a 200 to 250 NECA mark. But when we're talking about price and value, we've got to factor in the software, because DSM, Disk Station Manager version 7.2, runs on both of these. That actually takes up a decent amount of the price point of these for the long-term software updates, for the firmware and stability updates, and ultimately the single ecosystem that Synology run with a bunch of apps that rival that of third parties. But, you know, we'll talk about that more in the software section. Ultimately, between the two of them and what you're paying, needless to say, the DS224 Plus is not only the lower price point between them, but given the similarities in the hardware, and again, not completely identical, in terms of value, many of you will probably consider the DS224 Plus the better value of the two, given the similarities in their hardware. And that's true to a point, but there's definitely going to be users that see the slight distinctions in hardware between them that are going to be the tipping point towards that value. But ultimately, if the actual money you are whacking down on the table for your local e-tailer or local IT reseller, then the DS224 Plus wins this round. But it's not just about that, is it? Let's talk a lot more about the hardware and the connections on these devices. Now, I already said the hardware on both of these devices is pretty modest, and for what you are paying, it's not exactly breathtaking, but there are distinctions between them. Now, before we get to those distinctions, let's say what they've got in common. They're both running on Intel Celeron processors. That is the quad-core J4125 Celeron processor, 2.0 GHz per core clock speed. That can be burst up to 2.7 when needed. It's got a 10. It's rated at a TDP of 10 watts, and on top of that, it's got integrated graphics there. I believe it goes up to 750 megahertz there internally when needed on the integrated graphics, which could be used for more graphical enabled processes. Again, that includes more commonly transcoding or converting of multimedia files. So if you're running a Plex media server on this and you're running quite dense media, some dense 4K media, and that 4K media you're going to be accessing perhaps on your mobile device, on your tablet, on your home consoles. Maybe you're using remote connections there, so you're running the server somewhere else and you've got family members accessing it on metadata connections or more modest hardware, or they can't support certain file formats or compression techniques like HEVC on their local devices. You're going to be using converting and transcoding to reshape that file to be better suited to the destination client device. And in those cases, they've both got integrated graphics, and having that dedicated component of the CPU to work on that job means a much more efficient power usage when it's being done. Otherwise, you would use raw CPU power to get the job done and ultimately use way more power and use up a lot more electricity in order to get the job done, which can lead to components lasting slightly less time and ultimately the system having to work harder than it needs to get the job done. So it's great that these have got Intel Celeron processors with integrated graphics inside for those needs. But do bear in mind that is a pretty old CPU. What I mean by old? Well, we're talking 2019 release. That is a CPU that we've already seen used in a bunch of other Synology NAS systems that date way back to the DS920 Plus, released in 2019 to 2020 with other releases as well, summer 2020 to be precise. And that CPU is really showing its age. Even Intel themselves have dropped it. So why Synology is still using it is properly winding me up. But we've at least got to be fair that CPU is integrated graphics, and that's what a lot of people wanted on this series. Now, alongside that, there's a couple of gig, 2 gig to be precise, of DDR4 memory that can be upgraded to 6 gig of memory, which is proper weird, but enough on that another time. Now, that's 2 to 6 gig of memory is made up of 2 gig of soldered memory internally, and both devices have got the ability to add a 4 gig official upgrade inside there. Alongside this, the systems also arrive with a couple of Ethernet ports on both systems. They've both got USB ports, front and back, USB 3.2 Gen 1, so 5 gigabit there. And there we can see in terms of network connectivity, 2 1 GBE ports on both of those systems. Now, before we get on to the distinctions, the obvious ones, it's worth highlighting those USB ports on both of these can't really be used for anything more than storage. They support UPSs in a very small number of devices, but if you were hoping to take advantage of network upgrades to use 2.5 gig or 5 gig, That's not possible. You can't even use 1 gig network upgrades on this to add more network connections onto this. It was a real bummer when you're seeing things like port trunking, link aggregation, and of course SMB multi-channel, allowing you to bond multiple ports very, very easily and take advantage of larger bandwidth there. You can do it with the 2 that's on there, but it's a real shame we can't scale that up. But it's on the subject of scaling things up that we've got to talk about this, because although neither of these devices support expansion devices like the DS423, and what you've got here is the base level storage and you can't scale up later, both of these devices support Synology Hybrid RAID, but this 4-bay will allow you to buy, if you choose either one of these, if you bought either of these and you bought 2 hard drives, you could put 2 in that, and that's your lot. Can't scale up unless you start using new drives, or buy a new NAS later, move those drives into the bigger NAS. This, on the other hand, you could put those 2 drives inside here, and a few years from now, add another drive. And a few years later, add another drive. And it will allow you to scale up your storage. Now, yes, you're paying an extra $150 off the bat to do that, but if you think you're going to be scaling storage later, this 4-bay allows you to just scale up the drives gradually over time. And thanks to support of Synology Hybrid RAID, it will allow you to say on day 1, add a couple of 4 TB drives in here, and when you add a new drive, you can go for a bigger capacity, go for an 8 or a 10. Then on the next drive, go even bigger. And SHR allows you to capitalize on growing hard drive capacities within a single RAID, because it's a hybrid RAID system in a way that traditional RAIDs can't. Now, that isn't to say this doesn't allow SHR support. As I say, it does. But because you've got 2 drives in there, almost certainly they're going to be mirrored. So you're going to halve your capacity, because 2 drives in a mirror is so you've got 1 drive of safety net failure, which means if you put 2 10 TBs in there, you can only use 10 TB of storage. The result is on this, you've got that lower glass ceiling in terms of long-term storage capability that isn't going to be the case here. Now, talking of storage capabilities, we got to talk about these. This system here on the base has got 2 M2 NVMe slots. Those 2 M2 NVMe slots there allow you to add 2 much faster NVMe drives into this system. NVMe drives like these allow you to not only use them for caching, which will improve data that is written to the device thanks to write caching when you upload it or write to the SSD, and then the system will move it internally to the hard drives. But you've also got read caching, where more frequently accessed smaller files are copied over to the SSD, and then moving forward, those files are then accessed instead of the slower hard drive files, making things a lot more responsive. It only really impacts smaller files, so you won't really feel it outside of the responsiveness or certain small-scale I/O and metadata type files, but it is beneficial. But on top of that, you can also use these M2 slots for storage pools if you use Synology's own drives. Now, if you use Synology's own drives in this and therefore use those storage pools, you can create either 2 super fast, I'd say super fast, between 800 and 1000 megabytes per second storage areas that you can then use either for running applications, for running virtual machines, for running databases, or for faster backups there. You could use one SSD for read caching and another SSD for storage pools. This allows that. Remember that 150 quid price tag extra? That's where some of that money goes. The extra bays and those NVMe's. Whereas this device, on the other hand, it doesn't have them. So you can only use those 2 drives of storage. So again, maybe when you're weighing these 2 devices up, think about where that extra 150 is going, because you're not getting it in the CPU and the memory, but you are getting it in some areas of scalability and performance. But just bear in mind that this device, if you're going to use those storage pools, you got to use Synology SSDs, which costs more and the performance is a little lower. Also remember, this is a Gen 2 system, not a Gen 3 system like the DS923 Plus. And that lowers the bandwidth afforded to those M2 NVMe slots, which are already being bottlenecked slightly for temperature reasons and just general running. Now, when it comes to software on these devices, they both run DSM 7.2 really, really well. They run the full range of applications as well as some of the new improvements in DSM 7.2, such as immutable backups thanks to write once, read many support and encrypted volumes, and the innovations and improvements that have occurred in some of the other applications like Synology Office and Surveillance Station. Now, DSM, again, as mentioned, is part of the purchase price of this device, and you have access to the full range of those apps and services. And dare I say, for most users, regardless of which one of these two you use, you are never going to see the difference between either of them in terms of DSM. The only time, and I really do mean this, the only time that DSM is going to run any better on one of these than the other is when you're talking about the extra drives. Because once you've got 4 drives rather than 2, in the right RAID configuration, be it an SHR or a RAID 5, or even a RAID 0, you are having multiple drives being read and written to at any given time. The result is that the system will run that little bit faster compared with 2 drives being read and written to at the same time. And thanks to the innovations of including those M2 NVMe slots there, whether you use it for caching or as storage pools for individual applications, databases and services, you're still going to feel those improvements in DSM. Now, for the average small user or small cluster group user, you're not going to feel the difference. But once you start scaling up the number of simultaneous users, simultaneous applications and simultaneous services running from these systems at any given time in DSM, that's when those extra bays, both NVMe and storage SATA, are going to be felt. And therefore, in terms of the broader long-term picture, in terms of software, DSM and third-party apps, things are going to run better on the DS423. I'm not just talking about VMs, which of course are going to allow you to assign a lot of those CPU cores manually, or containers, which can, even more incrementally allow you to assign system resources, but just general system processes, and even things like multimedia are generally going to run at the stress points better on the 423 than on the 224 Plus, thanks to those additional storage values. Which brings us to the conclusion, and needless to say, I'm going to be recommending the DS423 Plus over the DS224 Plus. Now, why is that? Well, if I've not made the point clearly enough, yes, it is an extra 150 nicker more, but in terms of scalability, in terms of long-term upgradability, and in terms of just generally long-term use of the device as a home or a business user, the extra 2 bays and the M2 NVMe's there are going to be beneficial. Yes, in a way you are paying 150 nicker more for the option to spend even more later on NVMe's and hard drives. I acknowledge that. And also, if you look at the supported hard drive lists from Synology on the compatibility list for hard drives and SSDs, you find that these devices have actually got quite a narrow range of supported hard drives from the likes of WD, Seagate and Toshiba, nowhere near as restrictive as some of the XS series from Synology, which can only be used with Synology's own drive media on their compatibility lists, but nonetheless the range of supported drives on these are actually surprisingly small. And as acknowledged earlier, the M2 NVMe ports on this, if you're going to use storage pools, you've got to use Synology's own drives. However, all of that aside, if you're looking at these two, do yourself a favour, and whatever the hard drives you were going to look at, knock off a couple of terabytes. If you were going to look at a couple of 10 TBs, with installation inside this, go down to 8 TBs and use this, or use the extra money you save towards going for the bigger box. You will be thankful for it years down the line as you scale up your amount of storage, as you scale up your utility on the device, and ultimately that money that you may be spending more now will be recouped later. And I mean this, if you're a home user or if you're a business user, it doesn't matter, because both of these devices are incredibly modest in their power footprint, and more importantly, you won't use more power on this until you start scaling up that storage, until you start using those 2 M2s. This system will only use more power based on those fans. That's it. And that uses virtually no extra power. Even in terms of noise, these systems are near enough identical. It's really just going to come down to this system's scalability and the benefits it brings. And if that's the most important thing to you long term for your storage, that you are thinking of buying now, but you know how things are going to grow later, spend the extra 150 nicker. If you really don't think you're going to be scaling up your storage and you really don't think your needs are going to grow as well, both in terms of individual processes and users, the DS224 Plus is still a solid choice overall. But nevertheless, let's conclude this one is the one I would pick over the two, and I hope you agree with me. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, there's a written comparison guide below over on NAS Compares, where we break things down even more into the hardware and software on these devices. So I recommend you check that out, and hopefully that'll help you choose which is best for you. Talking about which is best for you, if you still need more help, use the free advice section over on NAS Compares, or use our free community forum Ask NAS Compares, or you can go over to our Discord to learn more. Finally, if you found this video and my other videos on this subject helpful, and if you were going to shop at the likes of B&H, Amazon, Box, CCL Online, and more, if you were definitely going to go to those stores, and both of those things are true, then please use the links in the description to take you to those stores. Not only because it won't cost you anything extra to use them, but it will take you directly to the store in your region. And whatever you buy, and I really do mean whatever you buy, will result in a small fee coming back from those stores to us. It's just me and Eddie here running NAS Compares, and those small donations passively made by you allow us to keep doing what we do. And I thank you if you do that. Thank you so much for watching, and have yourselves a great week.